Welcome, Alan and Heather. Welcome, Jenny. Great to have you. Good to see you. And also, as folks are putting their location and notes in the chat box, if you are able to grab a pen and paper near you, there's going to be one short activity where we'll be using pen and paper. So if that's accessible, please grab those. Welcome, Colleen. Back in DC from some overseas, smiling because I'm excited about and inspired by work these days. Awesome. Love to hear that. Welcome, Dana and Carol. Welcome, Regan.
Hi, sorry for being so last minute.
No worries. Good to have you. You're sounding great.
Great.
And the sun is shining behind you in a brilliant way. Looks good.
Very luminous over here.
Welcome, Tracy. Welcome, David. Good to see you. For folks just joining, if you want to put where you're calling in from and something that made you smile this morning into the chat box to get a sense of where folks are at. Carol in sunny, snowy Boston, and Alan from Atlanta, Georgia, walking your dog while traveling. Beautiful. After traveling, I should say. And yeah, welcome to the folks that are just joining. Joshua, I think we have Dana already. Gayatri, good to see you. JM, welcome, welcome. For folks just joining, if you want to share your location and something that made you smile this morning in the chat box. Lexi from San Francisco, where it's sunny, smiled this morning after your migraine lifted. Glad to hear that. Glad we could receive you clear-headed. And Regan from San Francisco, also sun and shining. Beautiful. We'll give folks one more minute to join. Welcome, Masaki and Judy. Great to have you. Welcome, Rachel. Welcome, Andrew. Great to have you back. David from San Francisco sharing that the sun is peeking through the trees. Beautiful, and a good international conversation this morning. Awesome. Curious to learn more. And Andrew coming in from Louisville. My dad's from Louisville, and he can say it much better than I can. Louisville. Can't do it. Nice to have you. Welcome. And welcome, Jennifer. All right, so as folks, thanks for the coaching, Andrew. So as folks continue to join, we're gonna get started. And as I mentioned a couple minutes ago, if you can access a pen and paper, we're gonna be doing a brief intro activity that involves a pen and paper, so if you have access to that. And so we're going to get started. So welcome everyone to the fourth in a 5-part webinar series on the underlying stories and narratives and that climate philanthropists and funders hold. And this is, my name is Lindley Meese, and this is hosted by the CLIMA Fund, which I'll mention more about in a moment. But this series was really started to grapple with some of the assumptions and frames that underlie decisions inside and outside of philanthropy that really shape who and what climate solutions are funded and supported. And my colleague Jennifer is going to put in the chat box a blog that articulates and describes the 5 frames that we're exploring throughout the series. And we also created this series because there's this increasing schisms in climate philanthropy, which reflects the broader political moment. And we believe that diversity of opinion is really important. And we also believe that it's really important that climate philanthropy doesn't deepen the divisions that hinder strategic and just climate action, particularly when we're in a moment when unprecedented societal transformation, in the words of the IPCC, needs to be happening now. So we created this space for really emergent conversations that are based in listening and learning, which are ever so rare in philanthropy spaces. where we can really push each other to identify what are the underlying assumptions that shape our practice. And as I said on our last call, there's way more similarities than differences among the speakers and the perspectives that are going to be shared here today. And we're really here to suss out where are there different views and what can we actually learn from that. I'm reading Edgar Villanueva's book, Decolonizing Wealth, and one of the quotes he shared was, "Our beliefs are just one perspective, and the more rigid our perspective, the more alternative perspectives we miss." So in the spirit of that, I'm hoping that this can be a conversation where we uplift some of those alternatives and learn something new along the way. And we're really honored to have an amazing set of speakers yet again here with us. Let me actually, I'll take the screen off in a moment, and you can wave, and I'll be introducing them in a moment. But we have 4 speakers with us coming from all different corners of philanthropy that are going to be touching on the theme of climate within that's the context in which we're having this conversation, climate philanthropy, and specifically capacity. And how we approach capacity in the work that we do, and what are some of the deeper questions that we need to be asking related to capacity. So first, a couple of housekeeping things. This is a conversation, so to make this feel less like a bunch of talking heads, we're actually going to have or invite you all to take yourself off, have your videos up so we can see your faces, so the speakers feel less like actual talking heads. And we're also going to have a pretty active chat box. So if you can see at the bottom of your screen, there's a button where you can press chat, and that's where there's going to be side conversations that will be deepening what the speakers are sharing, and also where you can share questions that will be feeding into the conversation throughout our hour and a half together. One more note about the tech. If you have any questions throughout the hour and a half, we have Carol from Grassroots International, and you can find her name in the chat box and chat her directly if you have any questions or need any help throughout the hour and a half. She'll do her best to help you out. And lastly, a note on confidentiality. We are recording this call, which we'll share with the co-sponsors of the series. And if there are any media, we just ask that this is a conversation that's off the record. So if you want to reach out to any one of the speakers to follow up about anything that they've said, you're welcome to do so. But that this conversation itself stays as an emergent conversation that's not directly quoted. So finally, let's take a moment to center ourselves. Again, grab a notepad and a pen if you have it. A beverage, actually close down your email. It's really easy on webinars to be double tasking. And we also know that we know the human brain, we know it's really hard to be present and to be engaged when we have a lot of distractions up. So do our best to be present for the conversation and our speakers. And then we'll take a couple breaths together. Okay, so before we introduce the speakers, we're just going to introduce ourselves to each other. And to give ourselves a sense of who is in the room, Sam, our support, is going to throw up a poll. And this first poll is to identify who's in the space. So even though this you might wear multiple hats, Sam, if we can throw that poll up. We ask you to just pick one category. So what is the kind of affiliation or the role that you're bringing to this conversation today, just to get a sense of who's in the room. And for folks on the phone, you probably cannot participate in this, and I'll share the results in a couple seconds. All right, Sam, if we could throw up the results. Okay, so it looks like we're about half institutional philanthropy and about 40% nonprofits, interesting, and 3% interested public. We always have a small smattering of folks that are just interested in the conversation, which is awesome, and a couple individual philanthropists and others. Cool, great, thank you. And then also want to throw up one more poll, and this one is just to take a pulse of what folks' initial reaction to the frame of capacity is. So Sam, if we could throw up that poll. When you think of capacity in the context of climate philanthropy, what is the first thing that you think of? an individual's facility or power to take climate action, specifically a grantee's ability, or specifically a grant maker's ability, or other. So just getting a sense of what folks' immediate reaction or assumption is around capacity in climate philanthropy. All right, Sam, if we could show those results. So it looks like most folks' initial reaction is a grantee's ability or capacity. And then very few folks, 3%, an individual's facility or power, and then about 30% saying a grant maker's ability and 20% saying other. Awesome. And we'll have space in the chat box to share some of those other responses in a moment. Okay, so we're going to do one more intro activity, which is a quick breakout group into groups of 4. So you can introduce yourselves to each other and get a sense of who else is in this space. So in a moment, Sam will be pushing you into breakout groups. And before that, grab your pen and paper if you have it. And you're going to take 30 seconds. I know it's really quick. 30 seconds to draw your response to a prompt. And the goal of this is to really have an experience of the many different frames and assumptions that we bring to this conversation. So in your breakout groups, you'll be sharing this either visually or you can just describe it if you're on the phone. And the prompt is solutions to climate change. So take about 30 seconds to draw whatever comes to mind, any association you have with that prompt, solutions to climate change. Okay, so Sam is going to push you into breakout groups. You'll be sharing your name, your gender pronouns, where you're calling in from, any affiliation that you think is relevant, and then sharing very briefly, either visually or just describing what you shared in this prompt. And you'll have about 1 minute each to share, and then about a minute to reflect on what are some of the differences that emerged in how folks approached or reacted to this. Okay, so Sam will take us away. You'll see a screen pop up and just click yes, and phone folks will be pushed automatically into their breakout rooms. And if you're on the phone, if you press *6, it will unmute you. And for those still in the main room, we're gonna let Sam take a couple moments to push you into your breakout groups. And if you're still here, we'll do the activity together.
And back on.
So again, Chunghwa? So for those still here, Alex and Randy and Sophia, if you can hear me or if you're able to participate, if you want to unmute yourselves and share your name, affiliation, where you're calling in from, if you want to share anything about your drawing.
I can go.
Awesome.
I'm Alex. I was just hopping over from the phone call to the video. So I am with Morgan Stanley. and I drew a picture that was sort of money and power with arrows coming together. Yeah, that's what I put together, and pronouns are she and her.
Awesome. Thanks, Alex. Cool. For those just joining, we're in a small breakout group introducing ourselves to each other before we jump into the dialogue. So Amigo and Tanya and Jenny and Randy, if you want to unmute yourself and just share your name and where you're calling in from and your gender pronoun so we can see who's in the space. Hello, Liz.
Hi, Lindsay. How are you?
I'm good. Welcome. We're in small breakouts right now, introducing ourselves to each other.
Okay.
So we're back together. Sorry, Alex. It's going to be a little. This is always the main room is always an interesting place to be during breakouts. It's a little all over the place as people join and leave. Liz, do you want to introduce yourself? Alex just introduced herself to the group.
Sure. Apologies. The normally efficient Dutch train system canceled the one that I was on that would have brought me here in time, and I got booted. So I'm Liz McKeon with the IKEA Foundation. I lead our climate action portfolio work, and I've been involved in philanthropy since 1992 in different institutions.
Beautiful. And just so you know, we did a short exercise where folks drew what their first associations to solutions to climate change were, and then are sharing those with each other to kind of have a real experience of what our different assumptions are when we are approaching this conversation.
Okay.
Folks will be coming back in about a minute.
Okay. So you have people in physical space that are all uniting, and just we're joining virtually, or?
No, so Zoom allows you to put people into breakout groups. So
okay.
People are in all different virtual rooms right now, and then they'll all be pulled back into the main room in about a minute.
Okay. And are they sharing their drawings?
Yes, they are.
Okay.
And welcome to those that just joined the main room. We are in small breakout groups introducing ourselves to each other. You're in the main room, so welcome. And if you are able to, if you want to unmute yourself and introduce yourself, we welcome that. All right, so one more minute. Share my screen. Okay, welcome as folks start rejoining the main call. Welcome back. Please use the chat box to share any reflections that you have from that exercise. Oh, as folks finish their conversations. Use the chat box to share any reflections that you have around the different assumptions that folks were bringing or frames of reference that people were bringing to solutions to climate change that were surprising or different in your group. So I'll let folks have a moment to type some of those reflections into the chat box. Okay, so please keep those coming in terms of any reflections that folks have about the differences in frames of reference and assumptions that folks are bringing to the conversation around solutions. Not surprising, but reaffirming to hear that community was a common theme for most of our participants. So some definite shared frame and culture within this group for sure. In Colleen's group, combination focused on people power, others focused on institutions of power. So interesting to think about what is our initial reaction or association with where solutions are coming from. Really important for the conversation that we're going to be having about capacity. So as those reflections keep coming in, I'm going to kick us off and introduce our speakers and our hosts. So first of all, to give you a sense of who is bringing us all to the table, that is the CLIMA Fund. I'm the coordinator of the CLIMA Fund. CLIMA is a collaboration among 4 international grant-making organizations reaching grassroots climate work around the globe: Global Green Grants, Grassroots International, Thousand Currents, and Urgent Action Fund for Women's Rights. And we raise and re-grant funding for women, Indigenous, and youth-led climate work. All of that work is confronting the root causes of climate and also building local resilience. And we're kind of a fund for larger funders to be able to make big investments in grassroots climate solutions and working collectively to provide more of a continuum of support for grassroots movement building globally. And you can learn more about us online. Jennifer, if you can put our website in there. And we're really excited to host a fantastic lineup of speakers today. I will briefly introduce them and then you'll hear more in a moment. So we have Liz McKeon from the IKEA Foundation, where she is head of strategy and drives the climate change portfolio there. She has been in philanthropy for over 25 years, working in different different hats of global development, from the Ford Foundation to USAID to the MacArthur Foundation to the International Research and Exchanges Board, and is whip smart and super excited to have you at the table. We also have Chunghwa Hong. So if Chunghwa, let me take my screen off share so you can see folks' faces. If Chunghwa, you can wave, is the director of Grassroots International, and was named by the New York Magazine as one of the most influential people in politics. Chunghwa has been in this work for 25 years, working across healthcare and worker rights and human rights issues. I'm just really thrilled to have her heart and mind in this conversation. Next, we have Regan Pritzker, if you can wave. She is a board member at the Libra Foundation, where she works to align the endowment with their mission to support transformative social justice. And she's also a teacher and a mother of 3 in San Francisco. Really excited to have you. And then finally, we have Kathy Wright, who is the director of Build at the Ford Foundation, which seeks to build healthy civil society organizations. And we're going to be hearing a lot more about that in a moment. Before Ford, Kathy was the director of organizational effectiveness and philanthropy at the Packard Foundation. And prior to Packard, she was at the Social Policy Action Network. And has worked on the Hill and with elected officials, and has served all sorts of hats. And I also happen to know, I learned that in our last conversation, that she really likes cats and Jane Austen. So welcome all to all of our speakers. And as we kick off the conversation, I just want to make another plug for an active chat box throughout this conversation. I think something that's been special about these over the last 3 dialogues has been how much generative fodder has emerged in that space. So thank you for those that participate. And if folks want to kick off by sharing, when you think of capacity, what do you think of? We did that poll, but would love to hear a little bit more about what folks associate with capacity, so that our speakers can respond to that as well. So if folks want to put that in the chat box as we kick things off. So I'm going to ask each of our speakers to introduce themselves. You can respond to anything that you've been seeing and hearing thus far in the conversation, and would love to hear a story from your political or professional journey that has shaped how you approach philanthropy, and specifically what partnership with your grantees or the folks that your foundation supports looks like. So a story from that political or professional journey that has informed partnership and your approach to philanthropy. And if you want to share a little bit about your positionality and work, and then after that, we'll get into how you all approach capacity. So let's kick it off with Regan Pritzker.
Hi, folks. What a great group. Thanks, Lindley. And thanks to my fellow speakers today and all the folks on the call. My name is Regan Pritzker. I am the board president currently of the Libra Foundation. My mom is on the call. She is sort of co-president and comrade in arms. And I also do some independent philanthropy. I came into this work because I was born into a family with wealth. I am an elementary school teacher by background, but over the past kind of 5 to 10 years have leaned more heavily into the philanthropic work, really as a way of kind of integrating the different aspects of my life and trying to kind of understand what does it mean to be an heir and inherit money, personal wealth, and also engage in philanthropy, and trying to kind of figure out how to reduce dissonance across, for example, like investments for the endowment of the foundation, but also in my personal investments. And so just trying to kind of understand how the broader systems of our society work against our core values, which are human rights, human dignity, environmental sustainability and regeneration, and really trying to work against the accumulation of wealth and the wealth disparity that we have sort of benefited from in so many ways. So trying to kind of confront that dissonance. In terms of sort of how I've been inspired by partnership with grantees and what that looks like for us, a recent example of something that I found really powerful and moving was I had the opportunity to engage with Climate Justice Alliance and other members of the It Takes Roots Coalition to be in partnership around some funder organizing that we did around the Global Climate Action Summit that was in San Francisco in the fall. And it was a really interesting reminder of where capacity and power really does live, which is in movements and organizing and people. And I appreciated that David highlighted when we had to choose between, are we thinking about capacity for grant makers, or are we thinking about capacity for grantees, that there's this synergistic middle space, which is movement building. And that ideally those different pieces are working synergistically towards a common goal. And so this people's orientation, which was the funder kind of briefing that we worked on together, was a really amazing opportunity for me to kind of be in a space where I could take leadership from movement leadership, but claim my space and role as a funder to use my relationships or platform in a way that was in like a synergistic service to and relationship with the movement partners that were also sitting around that table. So that's an example, and I felt like it really broke down the typical dynamic of like the person with the grant money is the person with the power and the agency, because in that environment we were really acknowledging the power and agency of the information and the framing that we were really moved by and inspired us to think differently about the things we were hearing at the climate summit. So maybe I'll stop there because I want to hear from the other speakers, but that's an example.
Nice, thank you. And I love how you're already speaking to kind of breaking down the assumptions about who has capacity and how, and what that means for how we need to be building capacity as funder. Thank you. So I'll turn to Chunghwa. Would you be able to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. What a wonderful bunch of people, speakers and participants. So until recently, before I started at Grassroots International 4 years ago, I was not a funder. So I was on the asking side of things. But I worked at a range of different groups. I worked in a movement organization that had no money, all volunteers. I worked at a small grassroots organization and large national or regional coalitions. So just got to see capacity, experience capacity issues from different organizations of different shape and form. I think that's helpful. That's not really a story because story gets too long, but anyway. And then at Grassroots, I'm going to limit my comments to our particular, our work, which is we fund social movements around the world, mostly in the Global South. And so we're focused on thinking about capacity building in terms of what it looks like for social movements. And so for us, supporting social movement, we think the best way to describe it is accompaniment. as opposed to, like a bunch of other words. So we see our accompaniment of social movements as including grant making, including, supporting their capacity, including doing advocacy, and a range of things like that. As an opening thing, I would like to, usually funders think of capacity building or capacity as a set of competencies or knowledge or other resources to really get to perform better. But I wanted to add to that and reframe it a little bit to a question that of thinking about capacity as what gives you strength? What are the sources of your strength? And starting from there. I hope to talk about social movement examples based on that. I'll mention one example, one story. Is there time? I was in Brazil and last summer, and we went to visit an organization, and there was a member who was doing this amazing work in a garden, growing vegetables, agroecological vegetable, and he was just a member, one of thousands of members, but he said, I used to be addicted to alcohol. I used to be homeless, and I joined this group, MST, and now I have land, and I am teaching other farmers about farming. And so when I think about capacity, it's not just about the leaders or the organization, but is each member, each individual's potential fully contributing to the capacity of that organization, is, I think, a good point to start on.
Beautiful. Thanks, Chunghwa. Really appreciate that reframe of capacity being more than competencies and resources, but what gives you strength, individuals, organizations, et cetera. And thank you for that story of everyone mattering to the capacity of an organization and a movement. Thanks. We'll turn now to Kathy. Can you introduce yourself?
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kathy Rich, and I direct a program at the Ford Foundation called BUILD, which is a 5-year billion-dollar initiative to strengthen key institutions around the world who address inequality in all of its forms. At Ford, we think about inequality in political terms, social terms, economic terms, environmental terms. I've been doing this work at Ford for about 2.5 years. That's about exactly how old the BUILD program is. And before that, I was with the David and Lucille Packard Foundation out in California for about 15 years. Story from my political or personal journey that shaped how I approach philanthropy. I'm going to start with a story that does not show me in a really good light. You're going to think I'm a terrible person after I tell it, but it was very important in my journey. Early in my days as a funder, I was focused on funding early childhood policy reform in the United States. And at the time, this was the early 2000s, early childhood advocates were waging an uphill battle to liberalize a draconian federal welfare reform law and to try to increase federal child care funding for low-income families. And I'd come out of that world, and I knew it really well, and I knew all the people and all that stuff. And at one point, I said to one of the leaders whose organization Packard was funding to do this work, I said to them, I don't really see the point in funding you to do this for another year because it's just the same fight year after year and nothing ever changes. And this person was somebody that I had really mentored me earlier in my career, somebody who was really very seasoned in the field and had been doing it for a long time. And he said to me, do you think I like fighting this fight every year? Do you think I like asking you for money? I hate it. And that was such an eye-opener for me. At the time, I didn't realize quite what an eye-opener it would be, but I started to ask myself questions like, why wasn't I giving this organization unrestricted support? Why was I just giving it for this very limited, narrow childcare campaign? I wasn't really allowing them to be creative, right? Why wasn't I giving the organization multi-year grants so that this person did not have to come back to me year after year after year in what everybody knew would be a 10-year fight or even a 20-year fight? And perhaps most importantly, why wasn't I asking this leader for his advice about what and who and how I should be making these funding decisions, right? And ever since that time, I feel like I've been in this process of trying to unlearn my own bad behavior, right? How to be a better listener and how to be a better partner.
Thank you, Kathy. I really appreciate you sharing vulnerably a story that I think all of us in philanthropy can really identify with in terms of how difficult and uncomfortable it is to embark upon a process of unlearning, and also just the ubiquity of funders getting in the way and not listening. So thanks for that. We'll turn to Liz.
Hi, everyone. And Lindley, thanks for some great framing questions. I was scribbling so many notes to myself, so I'm really looking forward to really diving in, and want to thank fellow speakers for their contributions so far. It's really interesting to hear your reflections, and you can probably see me smiling on screen as I'm relating to a lot of what you're saying. So I'm Liz McKeon. I've been with IKEA Foundation for 5 years, a little more than that now, and I've been fortunate in my career in philanthropy to cut across a lot of different issues, from being more of a regional specialist in Russia in the days of the early transition from the USSR, to working on labor markets, human rights, all sorts of different issues. And if I had to give you an anecdote for what shaped in my journey, my view about partnership, I've always had a distaste for the asymmetry of power that exists between grantee and grant maker. But it really came home to me somewhere in a more recent aspect of my career. I had been leaving the Ford Foundation, having had to close down its office in Russia, coming back to New York, starting up a new program, but being at that inflection point in the recovery from the post-2008 financial crisis, where there was not enough resource to build up new initiatives. And I had a wonderful time at Ford, and always tried to be really respectful in my partnerships with different grantees, but you can never quite get away from the power dynamic, and it never came home to me quite as strongly as the day I walked out of the building and into a new secure job with a movement building organization. Nothing changed about me in the 24 hours after I left, but everything changed in terms of how the phone calls got answered. All of a sudden, the colleagues that I work side by side with as grant makers, trying to help this new group raise money, had a different posture towards me. And I don't think I got any less smart in that time, or any less polite or creative or anything else, but it really drove the point home. And so I start since that point, when I've worked for different foundations since, I start every conversation I try as a conversation of equals. What are we trying to get done here? And if I reflect and bring that into the climate work, which I've only been doing for a few years right now, I've really been the climate naive child in a sense. I will borrow from a documentary some of you may have seen, Living in the Future's Past, which I think sets out the fundamental challenge, which is, if we think about the long road of humanity, inequality began growing as soon as humankind was able to accumulate surplus. And our ability to grow surplus has been based on energy systems and resources from fossil fuels that vastly increase our productive capability and our consumption. Now, if we really think about what the science tells us, it is not sufficiently linked to the pragmatic implications of how we need to reorder economic systems in order to live within the science. And so we are in the race of our lives, but we are working at the edges of the problem. And so when I think about capacity, it is, what is the capacity that will help us drive towards a new economic order? And that will not necessarily be based on the surpluses that are accumulated through fossil fuel production and the surpluses that have created greater inequality in this world and those systems. And so that's usually my starting point. But I'll pause there because I know there's a lot to talk about.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate you bringing a little bit of your own journey around your relationship to power in philanthropy, and also that kind of bringing us into the conversation around capacity, and also how does the conversation about climate impact and shape how we orient and relate to capacity as funders. So to build off that, would love to hear how you all approach capacity in your work. And one of the things, I've said this to a few of you, but I think it's, this is a unique conversation, I think, because there's a lot of explicit criteria we use in philanthropy around measuring the capacity of our partners. And then I think there's a lot of implicit criteria that we bring to the table. And so would love to hear, ideally from each of you, how you all think about trustability and fundability in your work explicitly within your foundations, and also where do you see some of the implicit assumptions that we make around capacity and what that means in terms of where money does or does not go. And then, as Liz so eloquently did, you know, any ways that you see climate being unique to that conversation, would love to hear that as well. So Chunghwa, how about we start with you?
Yeah, a few things. I think within the climate context, I think we have to talk about redefining resilience. And a lot of the times, resilience is defined as, for when it comes to people who are affected by change, climate change, as they're just simply as, you know, you just need to become resilient enough to adapt to these new normal, and leave it up to the technocrats to do the mitigation work. And I really think we need to tap into the resilience that our grantee partners have. And it looks different for different communities. We don't do it by having a checklist. We really talk to them about what resilience, again, like where do you get your strength? And so an example of that is an indigenous community that define their resilience as community resilience praxis, right? So for them, resilience begins with life-nature force, or their ability to follow tribal law, cultural revitalization, resistance. These are the sources of resilience that I think are not counted. The community's connection to identity and history and their cosmovision is gives them enormous amount of spiritual strength to really not only survive, but survive with dignity and actually change systems that they're affected by. So I think that's an aspect that's kind of implicit that could be made more explicit. Another capacity suppressing thing, I think, is lack of gender justice. You know, where are we looking to build up capacity? You know, we should look at women and how not having gender justice is really suppressing the strength of the climate justice movement to get stuff done. So I think we could be a lot more explicit and deeper about that, make it more explicit, and, you know, not just like check off representation, but, you know, looking at groups that have a real feminist solutions and lens to the climate issue. I think there's a lot to learn there. I think we also underestimate movement to movement capacity building. One of the best grants that we do is under a program called Learning Exchanges. You know, sometimes we assume that capacity building comes from experts. Experts need to, you know, help grantees. But some of the best capacity building that we've seen is supporting one indigenous group to help build capacity of another indigenous group, for example. Or we support a project called the Desalim Brigades, where the more experienced social movements in Brazil support movements in Haiti. And it's a holistic capacity building as peers, because they're transferring technical knowledge about water management systems and seed preservation, but they're also doing capacity building around how to organize the political strategy. And so supporting global South to South, or even in the US, supporting frontline to frontline solidarity and mutual peer capacity building, I think is undervalued and need to be lifted up, to mention just a few of the things.
Cool. Thank you, Chunghwa. I'm really appreciating you uplifting that it's not just about what capacities funders may be looking for, and I really like your an invitation to redefine how we're thinking about resilience, but also what is lacking. So a lack of gender justice being a really important factor in the capacity of a movement to affect change, for example. And I know that there's a lot of conversation in the chat box about what is a movement and what are examples, and there's also a lot of responses happening. So thank you for that. And we'll definitely come back to all of the folks in the speaker as you speak, being clear about what do you mean by movement and what maybe how you, when your funder hat is on, how you think about that and what is not a movement as well. So let's turn to Kathy to hear a little bit about how you think about capacity. And just to point out, I'd love to hear if there are differences that you have with the other speakers, so ways that you actually might have a different orientation.
Great, thank you. So far, it's pretty much all agreement. So if you were hoping for fireworks, I'm not sure you're going to get them, but stay tuned. You know, at Build, when we think about criteria by which we choose the organizations and networks we're going to work with, it is really challenging because what we do is make 5-year grants that are a combination of general operating support and very flexible support for institutional strengthening. And the truth is that just about any NGO really needs this kind of support, no matter how big or small, emerging or established they are. And most of them could actually use this kind of support quite well. So it becomes a very subjective practice of figuring out who's quite right for us to be working with right now. And we have an extensive list of criteria. It's a set of, 2 pages full of questions we ask, but they are all qualitative and all subjective. There are no strict metrics that we look at. So if an organization has been running deficits, for example, or maybe even their financial controls are not as strong as you'd like them to be, that doesn't bump them from consideration. If an organization is very small and has struggled to establish itself, that also does not bump them from consideration. I think more important to us as we put together portfolios of grantees, and we've certainly done this in our natural resources and climate change portfolio, which is about a dozen or more different organizations, we're looking at different strengths within a system. I really love Chunghwa's question and the way she defines capacity is what is your strength? No one organization has to do it all. They have to do different things well, and they have to be able and willing to learn from and coordinate with each other. So a lot of the questions that we ask are things like, how do you learn from others? How do you partner with others? How open are you to advice and to feedback and to adapting your strategy as you go along the way? But just as an example, within our natural resources and climate change portfolio for Build, we have everybody from the Global Land Tenure Facility to Global Witness and Rainforest Action Network to indigenous networks like Aman and Khoika and AMPB. It's a very diverse range of groups. What they have in common is a readiness and a willingness and an excitement to up their game.
Nice. Thanks, Kathy. I'm really excited to hear what you learn as this program continues to unfold around, particularly around this question of networks and institutions and the nuances between them. And I also really appreciate you explicitly naming philanthropy is subjective. This conversation is based on a lot of assumptions that individuals in power are bringing to the table, and want to make that explicit in this conversation. So let's turn to Liz. I'd love to hear how you think about this at IKEA.
I think a starting point for us comes from the guiding values that IKEA itself set up for itself, which you can Google. I won't go through all of them, but it's a fairly unique enterprise, and we mirror those. And one of the central ones is about togetherness, which kind of reaches back to what Kathy said. What is your capacity to genuinely collaborate and to really look at problem solving outside the boundaries of your own institution? Because an organization that has that, I think sometimes we often fall in love with the deeply engaging and articulate leaders of institutions. But if employee 1 to employee 100 doesn't have the breadth and reach and flexibility to grow within that institution, then it's got a great head, but the corpus isn't there, right? So, and that's not necessarily a fault if there's willingness to change as well. But they have to start by being aligned to this idea of togetherness and really understanding where they want to travel and how they want to collaborate. To that, I have to say, and this is maybe more of a marker of some recent experience for me and learned wisdom that's come in some hard forms, has been that I'm paying much more attention to the boards that govern these organizations. Because, to quote my great-grandmother, the fish stinks from the head. But what I mean by that is that, you know, there are boards that are checking off the boxes, and there are boards that are deeply engaged in the careful and thoughtful governance and support and uplift of the mission and the people that are there. And they are so critical as the proverbial third eye that guides the work. So that's become much more important to me when I think also about one of the explicit and implicit kind of criteria that we use. I could, well, probably say a few more things, but I would just end by saying that I think when you look at the resident talent, skills, or strengths within an organization, a question that I always want to ask myself is this organization a binder or a divider? Now, there's room for disruption, and I think that can be really creative. But when we're dealing with fundamental collection action problems like climate change, we need binders. We need people who really know how to bring people together, really know how to focus all of their assets. We do a lot of coalition building, and it's not just because it's an ease of transaction cost necessarily, but because we truly believe in mobilizing the different talents under unified strategies. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Liz. Yeah, that's sticking with me. Who are we supporting as funders? And I want to turn back to that in a moment, but Regan, I want to give you a chance to share a little bit about how you think about this and how your staff think about this at the Libra Foundation.
Thanks, Lindley, and thanks everybody. I had sort of like one version of an answer to this question, and now I'm kind of thinking, inspired by everybody. There's comments about like all the different levels that I think about capacity from where I sit, which is in this like cross section of many different types of entities. So like as an individual or as a, you know, the chair of the investment committee of the Libra Foundation, there's just a question of capacity around like, which parts of your resources are you marshaling towards this work and in what ways, and how much are you willing to confront, as Liz pointed out, the, you know, the big systemic economic problems that are so entrenched, especially in the US context, but obviously everywhere as well, that are at a macro level are creating conditions that are really hostile to the transformative work we're trying to do and trying to fund, and sitting as a person who sits, you know, in that conflictual kind of a spot. So capacity, how do we marshal more of our resources towards alignment to the transformative, disruptive work that happens and is seated at this very grassroots level? So there's that the top to bottom kind of thing. And then as a foundation, the Libra Foundation is, you know, extremely interested in all of the things other speakers mentioned, like coordinated, networked, mutually in kind of referencing organizations that are led by, that are sort of like of, by, and for people of color, women, impacted community leadership, trying to just bring, you know, shift the balance of power and draw down power to those leaders. And then I also sit on the board of Global Green Grants Fund, one of the CLIMA members, and through like the Green Grants work, you know, we're focused on moving small grants to, again, local solutions. Those grants are, the decision-making of where those grants goes is decided by local advisory board members who are, you know, better positioned to really understand the local context. And sometimes the, you know, the most impactful solutions, as Chunghwa was kind of also highlighting, are really, you know, the ideas and the creativity are coming from folks who, you know, don't otherwise show up on kind of the Libra Foundation's radar, or, you know, certainly I would not be in relationship to. So an example of that is one of my fellow board members, Stefan Gelsich, who's a marine biology professor in Santiago, Chile, works with some local fisher women who had organized themselves. They were realizing that the kelp yields and the seaweed yields were getting lower and lower. And in a stark contrast to your kind of typical marine conservation project, where you have a multi-million-dollar, very technological, very police-heavy and kind of government-enforced conservation zone type approach, here these women were like, well, let's figure this out together. So they got together and they came up with a cooperative system to rotate, you know, who was cultivating on which days and how much each person could take in order to still maintain the yield. And they were incredibly successful in improving the yield and improving the kind of collective sort of wellness and financial stability of the community. And then those folks kind of went on the road to talk to other cities and towns along the coast of Chile. And so I tell that story, and there's a longer version of it, but just as a little kind of, you know, to tie this thread from like these very macro issues that we really need to confront. And then, but yet that doesn't mean that the people sitting at the top of this very systemic problem are the ones who have the best solutions that we really need to be learning from in order to actually accomplish this complex goal. So I just wanted to, I'll just leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you for that example. And building on that, would love to hear, you know, we're talking, this is in the context of climate. And I think, as everyone has already said on this call, we seek, and what is demanded is systemic transformation to meet this crisis. And I would love to hear from Liz and maybe also Kathy, how the conversations internally to your organizations, and I'm asking you because we talked about this a bit in our conversations before, about how you're thinking about what are the capacities and what are the assumptions that you're bringing to the table about the capacities that you think need to be built to support and uplift that systemic transformation. It's been drawing down power, Regan just mentioned. There's been vying for power mentioned. So I would love to hear you speak a little bit about what is the capacity that your foundations are desiring to support to get that transformation we need. Liz or Kathy?
Do you want me to start? Okay. It's a hard one to answer because it depends on which part of the problem we're looking at. But if I were to, let me just pick something in the middle, which is firefighting. And what I mean by that is, I'll give you an example of one of the unrestricted grants we give is to the Global Strategic Communications Council. And that is a network of journalists all around the world that are firefighting, either to get everyone on the same page about what a particular climate event means, or to try to clarify and stop stories that are spreading very negative ideas. You know, we live in a world where the media and social media default position for news is often about dissembling and sensationalism and not helping people actually understand the implications of particular issues. And because of that, and because largely the opponents to moving progressively on the transition to a low carbon economy are so much better resourced than all of us, we have got to try to do sense making within the larger context, because the people who feel climate change impacts every single day are the ones with the least voice and power. And the ones that have the greatest voice and power can easily outspend all of us. So working in that one particular way, it's not about those in power and those out of power, but trying to get the firefight at least a little bit more even keel is an example of capacity that we support to just try to level the playing field a bit. So I'll stop with that example.
Great, thanks. And Kathy, want to add to that?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a climate specific answer, right? We think of this pretty generally. I think that my hypothesis coming into this role was that there were many capacities that we needed to strengthen in order to enact change, but probably the top three were, first of all, strategic adaptability, so the ability to adjust rapidly to changing contexts, right? The second would be leadership, the ability to bind and not divide, to use Liz's words, and what kind of new models of leadership would we need to see to make that more possible. And then finally, a financial sustainability, right? The ability to continue to exist as an institution or as a network, because most of the fights that we are all fighting are very long-term in nature. One of the things that that working in this program has taught me over the last couple of years are that there are capacities, critical capacities, that need to be developed around equity, particularly in the US, racial equity, but also Chunghwa has referenced gender justice. Regan has talked about indigenous communities. There is a real need to both build the power of historically marginalized people to be able to have their voices heard, but also to build the capacity and willingness of established institutions to actually listen to them. And then, sadly, I think there is a whole set of capacities that need to be built around safety and security. And we are increasingly seeing that both physical safety and security, but also in the digital world. An important thing I want to say, though, about Build is we don't tell the grantees, you need to work on those things. We actually, the one requirement that we have in Build is that organizations who are going to receive this money go through an organizational assessment process, a facilitated process called the Organizational Mapping Tool. I'll put it in the chat box because it's now free and online and available in 7 different languages. But through that process and any other inputs they want to use, they come up with their own priorities for how they want to strengthen themselves. And then they tell us what their plan is for actually strengthening them. So they can hire people, they can invest in better systems, they can do culture work within the organization, they can even buy stuff like computers, vehicles, etc. So even though I've got my hypothesis about what's needed, and we do have the benefit of working now with over 220 organizations, we want them to tell us what they think is needed, and we want to learn from that.
Nice. Thank you. And yeah, I saw some nodding heads, so I'm sure folks would appreciate that link. So building on that, I would love to hear from Regan and Chunghwa. What are the capacities that you think funders need to build? We have been talking a lot about what are the frames that we bring as funders to like evaluating organizations that we seek to support, and the types of power that we seek to change. And I'm curious where you sit and your experience in philanthropy and building from what we've been sharing. What are some of the capacities that you think are desperately needed among funders to meet the scale of the crisis we face, and to wallow our way through the many challenges we've been naming on this call?
I can jump in for a second, if that's okay, Chunghwa.
Yeah, go ahead.
There's a couple things that are on my mind, and you know, kind of from the sublime to the mundane. On the mundane side, we were just having a conversation recently about sort of the role that the kind of, you know, as a foundation, the role that we can play to kind of push back on some of the institutionalized barriers to streamlining and improving processes and relationships between funders and grantees. So like, for example, you know, through the audit process, our auditors really wanted us to, you know, show all these multiple points of communications with grantees, and Crystal Haling, our executive director, was pushing back and saying, we don't want all those points of communication with our grantees. We are in relationship with them. We know what they're doing, and they are doing their work. We've given them multi-year grants. We don't want to, you know, have to have them fill out all these different documents that you say would be nice, you know, nice to have. And so she's like, what's the most basic legal requirement. We're going to do the minimum, not the maximum, right? And so there's this idea of like compliance and best practices that I think is an interesting, and again, very mundane, right? But critical shift in mindset. And there's an ability for folks at the sort of, especially I think on the private foundation, to kind of advocate and make us think about stuff like that. And then on like the more philosophical and broader spectrum, I think funders need to really be more honest about their sources of financial power and other forms of power, and be willing to confront the discomfort of saying like, oh, well, my philanthropy sits over here, but over here, maybe I have a big investment program or a private operating company, or even how we run our foundation, like even how we are actually doing our own, how we're relating to our own team members or who's on our board, right? Or should we even have a perpetual foundation? I mean, there's so many assumptions that are still connected to the sort of history of where philanthropy came from, that I think really need to be addressed if we're going to move beyond just kind of giving lip service to shifting power and changing dynamics that aren't so comfortable always, actually. It's not that easy to have those conversations or to push for that, or to really say like, what more can we do? So that's one thing. And then I also just wanted to bring in, I appreciate that Lindley mentioned she's reading Edgar Villanueva's book, Decolonizing Wealth, which I also read and really loved. And his framing of money as medicine is something that I think we all, is sort of sits at all these different levels. It's how we relate to one another and acknowledge the humanity and the work and the value of the grantee. So it's not like, well, we have money, so we have value, and you are needing of it. So I mean, it's on that relationship level, so transformative, but also as a broader society, how we are sort of the financialization of our world has eroded our connection to our planet and to each other in ways that are causing harm that even people with all kinds of power are harmed by, but might not see it.
Nice. Thank you, Regan. Really appreciate you naming the need to develop our capacity for discomfort in the spirit of honesty and transparency, and then weaving that with the reconnection that we must have with ourselves and each other if we're going to do this work and actually hold money as medicine. Chunghwa, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, speaking of decolonizing philanthropy, one thing that occurs to me is we have a program in Palestine. We're funding two similar programs. And so the question that I want to ask is capacity for what, right? Because both organizations really built up their capacity to run programs. So one of them had built up, like a multi-million-dollar program, and was building houses and building community gardens. But they were doing all of that without contributing to ending the occupation. So it was economic development, building economic capacity under the occupation. Whereas another grantee was doing those same activities, but did it in a way that contributed toward opposing the occupation. And so it's easy to, I think when we do capacity building, I think we just have to be aware that there's strong incentives to perform better within the system that they're in, and groups become like big NGOs, so what we call NGOification, and they lose that social justice political edge of like, what is this all for? And so I think it's, and colonialism in certain contexts have become such a sustainable, constant thing. People now, instead of talking about colonialism in that way, it's people refer to it as a coloniality of situation that just persists with the colonial mentality and so on. And so I just wanted to flag how inadvertently some of our capacity building programs could provide real incentives for NGOification of performing better under the current structures. And then just a thing to add about the security and safety issues that Kathy brought. I was talking to one community group who is now, we have to kind of, right now, so much of the work that our grantees are doing are either being redefined as a felony or terrorism. And this one organization I was talking to, the executive director was spending 60% of his time responding to these smear campaigns. And so in addition to providing kind of the tools and technical, digital security, all of that is very important. But just realizing how that affects the overall organization and what are the ways that we can support these organizations whose work is being just completely criminalized. So what kind of moral support, advocacy support can we provide is another issue. I think that's very important. Oh, and related to that, supporting emergency preparedness. Mm-hmm. There's a number of things that organizations can do to be more ready for things that they know are going to happen. We know that there's going to be escalation of repression in a number of countries where the right wing has taken over state power and has the police and all of the tools that they need. So, and this will be an additional funding support, which is so hard for public foundations to do, any foundation to do, but emergency preparedness is another capacity to support.
Thank you, Chunghwa. Really appreciate you naming just how important it is for funders to examine what are our assumptions about capacity, because often those assumptions then drive an entrenchment of the current system, our system as funders in particular, that might be counter to actually the transformation we've been naming. And then also the importance of supporting orgs more than financially to confront criminalization and emergency preparedness. So thank you for that. So this has been super juicy, and I want to keep going, but I also want to make sure that participants have a chance to metabolize and speak to each other. So what we're going to do is we're going to take 10 minutes to go into breakout groups where you'll have a chance to speak to one another, and Sam will push us into those breakout groups in a moment. And then we're going to come back together for to hear a final word from each of our presenters and then close out. So a couple of questions to consider as you are in breakout groups. And there won't be a facilitator in these breakout groups, so you'll be self-facilitating, but a couple of questions to sit with as you move into those conversations. What assumptions did you hear emerge in the conversation in terms of what you heard? How do your views align or differ from what was presented? And what is one way your understanding of capacity has shifted, if at all? So Sam, let's move into those conversations. If you want to take a moment to type a reflection or a highlight from those conversations into the chat box, would love to hear it.
I'm done.
Welcome back, everyone. As you are joining, take a moment to share a highlight from that conversation in the chat box. Thank you for doing that. And thank you also for just the really rich conversation that's been happening in the chat. Questions, answers to questions, musings, really appreciate the substantiveness of that conversation. So from Regan, importance for shared definitions. Yes, absolutely. And taking the, it's so often we don't take the time to create those shared definitions, and taking the time. From Nina, philanthropy playing the role of binder. Yes, that was the theme. And being really self-conscious in how we're bringing ourselves to that role. From Andrew, seeing the value of having more time next time in the breakouts at the end of a great conversation. Yes, as always, striving to have more time. From Jennifer, shift needed to economic order and how we think about natural resources impacting how we think about capacity. Yes. From Kelly, how can grantees select grantees? Yes, complicated and super important conversations around how we are democratizing the process. From Brian, how to appreciate multiple roles, the disruptors, those challenging power on the front lines, and those bridging to within existing power structures, and how to connect the two. Yes, super important. From Jennifer, gratified to hear about capacity as strength and create authentic relationships with grantees. From Carol, our grantees and partners increase our capacity for courage and boldness. Great, so keep those highlights coming. I would love to do, so we're going to do two more things together. First, I'm going to ask Sam to throw out the final poll. And this poll is just to get a sense of how folks received the conversation and if anything's shifted. So Sam, if you can throw up that last poll. So what's been the impact of this conversation? I learned something that has shifted my perspective. I did not shift my perspective. I have more questions than answers. I'm fired up to think deeper. And I know it's difficult to do multiple choice, but choose the one that best suits how you received, what you've received in this conversation. Okay, Sam, let's conclude that poll and show the results.
Fired up.
Fired up, 64%
wow.
are fired up. And the 40%, I have more questions than answers, and 30%, I learned something that has shifted my perspective. Awesome, that's great to hear. So I want to, Jennifer is going to throw in a link to the evaluation form. We have one more of these dialogues in this particular series and would love to hear beyond. I heard you, Andrew, in terms of a little bit longer breakout. If there's other reflections that folks have around how we can improve this, it's literally 1 minute, 2-sentence, a 2-question survey. So thanks for taking a moment to answer that. And I want to close this out by giving each of our speakers a chance to share any final reflections, particularly coming out of that breakout group. And if you can limit your, less than a minute final reflection. And I also invite you to share a question that you want to leave the participants with. So let's turn first to Kathy.
Wow, that's not an easy thing to do. I think that a couple things I'm reflecting on after this conversation is how can we, as funders, listen more deeply, and how can we share power more effectively? And the question that I would leave you all with is, what do you think it's going to take to actually shift funder behavior beyond just the people on this call?
Beautiful. Thanks, Kathy. Regan, let's turn to you.
Gosh, that is also, yeah, it's hard. I think the thing I'm leaving with is this idea of being very direct about confronting the systemic like structures, armatures that hold us in from the changes we actually need. And really needing to think about our political and economic systems, even when we would rather think about like these smaller detailed decisions and how they reinforce each other. But even when you're kind of needing to look at the small things, always keeping the bigger structures in mind.
Nice, thanks, Regan. Liz.
Thanks. I've been reflecting for the last few minutes on the discussion earlier about the risks that grantees are frequently facing and the capacity that we need to support around those risks. And I think my final thought would be that if we really truly, as funders, want to think about capacity in those situations, we shouldn't be thinking about funding a grant for a project or maybe even core support, but examining what is the most burdensome thing that organization or group of people have to deal with. It could be, if I reflect back to my time in human rights funding, where our grantees were getting, the landlord was kicking out the lease, we would buy a building so that they had that kind of asset security. So we need to think differently about those things. And I think that is a part of capacity we didn't touch on today. If I would throw back a question to everyone, when do we need to throw KPIs out the window on capacity?
Nice. Thank you, Liz. Chunghwa?
Yeah, I mean, since I'm in the funding social movement space, I feel like just learning constantly from social movements has, you know, it just keeps us honest, keeps us humble. So I would love to see more mainstream funding, you know, beyond those of us on this call. Try to move more money to social movements that are on the front lines. And then I want to leave you with a quote. One of our feminist partners is World March of Women, and Graça Samo is the president of it. And when she does workshops with other women, she says, we have the capacity within us. And that's the beginning of the workshop. And yeah, I've always remembered that.
Thanks, Chunghwa. Thank you to all of our presenters so sincerely for your insights and vulnerability and wisdom on this call. And thank you to each and every one of our participants. Really, thank you for joining us, for your attention, for your contributions and participation. It's been a really valuable conversation for me, and a lot has been shared. As always, I'll be following up with some highlights and more details about the next dialogue, which will be on April 24th, exploring the frame of geography and climate, which I think will be really interesting. And Sam is going to unmute us all so that we can do a round of applause for our speakers to close us out. Thank you. Have a beautiful rest of the day, y'all.
Thanks all.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Lindley.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Lindley.
great facilitating.
Hey, Gayatri.
Hi, Regan.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
So nice to see everybody.